Hello and welcome. You are listening to an informed take on current events brought to you by law students and staff of Queen's University Belfast. This is LawPod. Welcome to the LawPod. My name is Shad Maruna, and this is the Criminology series of the QUB LawPod. I'm a professor here at QUB. I'm actually a professor in the School of Social Sciences, Education, and Social Work, formerly a professor here in the School of Law. Delighted to be here. This is a real treat. It's also one of my first podcasting experiences, so apologies up front. But I'm delighted, especially, to have an old friend here in the studio with me, and we are in a proper studio, by the way, here in the School of Law. They have all the great kit and very impressive set of microphones here. I'm sitting across from Professor Fergus McNeill from the University of Glasgow, a colleague and friend whom I've known for maybe 12, 15 years now, and for our sins, we have worked together on quite a number of projects. I guess I've probably been involved in about a tenth or a fifth of Fergus's many projects, and we've got him here today to do an examination of a PhD student. He's also going to do a workshop for our school in social sciences, but we thought we'd also get him here on the podcast. And there's so many things I could talk to Fergus about. If you're not aware of him, you've got a website, Fergus, that you could plug here abroad, fergusmcneill.com or anything?
Nothing quite like that, but you can find me on the University of Glasgow website. I'm in the School of Social and Political Sciences there.
Of course you are. Yeah, so
And of course I should mention the Scottish Centre for Crime and Justice Research, which is my main home.
Paying the bills, absolutely, yeah. So Fergus is involved in so many interesting projects. A thing called Vox Liminis. Tell us 10 seconds on Vox, maybe.
So that's a third sector organisation I work with, which aims to bring creative practice to sparking conversations about criminal justice and its reform. And it's a key partner in Distant Voices project, distantvoices.org.uk, which is worth a look. And that's my main ongoing project.
Well, one of your main ongoing. I mean, Fergus also would be known internationally for his work on mass supervision, and he has a brand new book that we could be plugging. We won't plug, but if we were to plug the book, what's the book called, Fergus?
It's called Pervasive Punishment: Making Sense of Mass Supervision, and that was published by Emerald back in November.
Indeed, and getting all sorts of attention, and is a fantastic contribution to the research on probation, parole supervision, and the sort of hidden growth internationally in that regard. But we're not going to talk about any of those things today. We're going to talk, since this is a Queen's Law Pod, we're going to talk about a project that Fergus and I started way back, maybe 2013.
Actually, it was earlier. I think we started it in 2010, 2011.
Good Lord, the time. Where does it go?
What's more frightening is that we officially finished it in 2012.
Okay.
But we're still kind of doing it.
You know how these things go. Yes, these projects are never quite end, and maybe to not the worst thing in the world. This is a kind of a work of a lifetime. But I'm going to have Fergus tell us about it. This was because it was his brainchild, really, and I will take no credit for this idea. I was doing desistance research for a long time before Fergus was. I can say, in fact, Fergus at this point hadn't done any desistance research or a whole lot. But Fergus, I should say what desistance is. Desistance from crime is the study of how people, for forever, criminologists have studied how people get involved in criminal behavior behavior. Desistance is the flip side of that. How do people get out of criminal behavior once they get into habitual patterns of criminality? How do they break free of that? How do they go straight, as it would have been called a year ago, and now is no longer politically correct? But what is that process? Now we call that desistance from crime. So this is something I had studied for at least 15 years or more by the time Fergus approached me about this project. But Fergus has had a vision, still has a vision of how that research could impact practice, could change the way we think about probation, prisons, the criminal justice practice. And he applied to the ESRC, the Economic Social Research Council, and shout out to them for funding this for what he called a Desistance Knowledge Exchange project. What's a knowledge exchange, and what's which became called DESCI? What's DESCI all about, Fergus?
Okay, so there were 4 collaborators, you and me, and Steve Farrell, who was then at the University of Sheffield, now in Derby, and Claire Lightowler, who actually was a key influence in helping me understand what knowledge exchange was about. She worked at that just before we did this project together. She was working in the Scottish Centre, but by this time she'd moved on to something called the Institute for Research and Innovation in Social Services in Scotland, IRIS. And Claire was a specialist, still is a specialist, in bringing together different forms of knowledge to engage with complex social problems, social policy problems, social work practice problems. And that expertise had particular value for me at that time, because you and I, Shad, and Steve had been putting a lot of rubber on the road, responding to requests for inputs on desistance research, particularly at that time in the context of English probation. Mm-hmm. So there were lots of training days, lots of conferences, a lot of excitement about this body of evidence, which, although in some respects it wasn't new, it was being brought to practice, interest and engagement with practice really for the first time around the early 2000s, so the latter half of that first decade. I'd published a paper in 2006 called The Resistance Paradigm, mm-hmm. which got a bit of traction. And invitations came on the back of that. And we were all getting a bit tired of showing up, sprinkling the magic fairy dust of academic knowledge, and then departing the scene and waiting for magic effects. And Claire, in my kind of conversations with her, had long since persuaded me that was not the way to go about serious engagement with policy, practice, and with other publics. And that really we need a more respectful kind of sustained engagement, nested in a set of relationships with policymakers, practitioners, and others. Crucially, in this case, people with lived experience of desistance. And so we got thinking, the 4 of us, we got thinking about, well, how will we do that? How will we do that in a way that really engages people and sustains their interest and brings out their knowledge and isn't too academic-centric? So we struck on the idea of making a film, a documentary film about desistance from crime, and we'll maybe say a bit more about that in a moment. That was one strand of the project. A second strand was to run a series of workshops where the film was the kind of stimulus material for a dialogue between all those constituencies, all those forms of knowledge, and those were run in various places over the course of 2 days, separated by a few months. So we met for 1 day, did a certain amount of deliberation and dialogue, then we went away and reflected, and then we came back a couple of months later and finished it off. And out of the workshops, we developed a set of provocative propositions for criminal justice reform. But we also, the third strand was a blog called Discovering Desistance, which became very lively with lots of contributions from people with lived experience, from academics, from practitioners, from postgraduate researchers, most recently from people serving time in prison, reflecting on and thinking about desistance, both in that context and in preparation for release. And through those 3 forms of activity, the filmmaking, the blog, and the workshops, we were really just trying to figure out together what to do about this body of evidence.
As you say, the idea at the beginning was to save ourselves some work. That we were feeling exhausted in the late 2008, 2009. It didn't quite work out that way. We ended up working twice as hard, maybe 3 times as hard. If all that Fergus described sounded like a lot, you should have been there at the time. It was an enormous undertaking. All of this, it felt like Desky became our lives for a good few of those years. The workshops were fantastic. The feedback, the energy, but then it was about trying to do something with all of that, and that became its own kind of never-ending. There was a set number of workshops that we had funded through the grant, but of course these begat other workshops. So we had prisons approaching us, wanting us to bring the roadshow into prisons. Certainly lots and lots of probation trusts doing the same, and we ended up probably giving more talks than we had before, but in a different form. We had a new way of delivering that wasn't just the usual PowerPoints and here we go, 15 minutes of droning on, and then we'll sit down. It became a much more interactive journey, and some highlights for you, Fergus. What were some of the best things that came out of that experience?
Well, I mean, you're right. It was ironic, I guess, that it produced even more travel and even more demands to engage. But for me, the key highlight was that the terms of the engagement changed and the quality of the engagement changed. I think that was partly driven by the fact that the film connected with people and brought experience out of them in a way that conventional forms of academic dissemination rarely do. So it set up the project as a dialogical project instead of us droning on, as you say, in a conventional didactic monologue and then having a Q&A. But it also took us all over the world in the end. The workshops that were funded were in Sheffield, London, Belfast and Glasgow, but I remember doing workshops in Adelaide, in Sydney, in Boston,
Buenos Aires,
lots of places all around Europe as well, Singapore, and the common thread, I think, or where this worked at its best was when we had a room full of people who all brought something different. One highlight for me was in a Glasgow workshop where I was sitting around the table with the then governor of Barlinnie Prison, the biggest prison in Scotland, who was sitting next to a 12-year-old girl whose mother at that time was in prison, who was accompanied and supported by, I think, a grandparent. Then there was a frontline social work practitioner of 30 or 40 years experience next to them, and maybe 2 or 3 others, and we were chatting about the film, and one of the key themes in the film, which people really related to and engaged with, was hope. And hope was a kind of recurring motif of this project. But I remember vividly when this girl said, hope is really, really critical. It's just difficult to sustain hope when somebody keeps on letting you down. And the way that the group engaged with that comment and tried to support that young woman, both sort of validating her experience and being challenged by it in terms of the kind of glib and easy things that we might say about our belief in people's capacity to change. So that was a kind of particularly affecting and important moment for me. But there are so many in the life of this project; it's hard to pick any out. You mentioned the film, and I should give a shout out here to the film company was a local Belfast group that we ended up working with, Login Media, and Eamon Devlin was the director of that project, and Eamon had worked for years in McGabry and other prisons. And so had that experience that he brought and his whole team brought to the process. But it is something about working in that medium of film where largely the methodology was very similar to methods that you and I both use. We were interviewing people about their experiences. We interviewed a couple of academics, John Laub,
Peggy. No, not Peggy.
Steve Farrell was in it himself.
One.
I can't. Faye Taxman.
Faye Taxman. That's who I was trying to think of. Yes, Faye Taxman. So some very prominent academics, but we also interviewed practitioners. We interviewed individuals with lived experience of all sorts of the desistance process, and it's that the medium of the film allows most importantly people to engage with them as human beings, looking at them in the face, hearing them tell their stories to the camera, and very similar themes that emerge in our research, but it changes the nature of the communication with.
I think it's also significant, and here again we should acknowledge some debts. Alan Weaver fronted the film as our kind of narrator and the interviewer in those scenarios, and we obviously spoke at length with Alan about the kind of questions that we wanted to explore. But I think it made a big difference that it was him, not us, asking the questions, because it wasn't an academic with an abstract interest or a purely research-related interest exploring the experience of others. It was somebody who was speaking from lived experience himself. His book, So You Think You Know Me, is a great autobiography that explores these themes. And also Beth Weaver, in the background, she was still doing her brilliant PhD at that point, later published as Offending and Desistance. But that was kind of part of the background of what was helping to inform the work as it was running, both feeding Alan material and ideas and feeding the rest of the project as well.
So. Yeah, absolutely, yes. And it became Alan's journey, the film, and many folks rightfully say the Road from Crime. Oh, you mean the film about Alan Weaver? And it was, although he starts the film by saying this is not a story about me, and it's not an autobiography like his book. But rather, it's a story about him learning about desistance and going on this journey with the audience, so to speak. And yes, it brings that journey to life on so many different levels because of Alan's experience in his life. And we meet his brother along the way. We meet one of Alan's oldest friends from growing up, who was willing to work with us in the film. At the time, was living rough and in the Glasgow area, and some really tragic. And also incredibly moving lives and life stories in the film. So the film, I should say, is still available for download. We're winding down the blog, and in a sense, this is our goodbye to that aspect of the project with this podcast. But the film has always been available for free. It's not a Netflix situation. This is something you can find online if you go to the Discovering Desistance.
Yeah, the Discovering Desistance blog will close as a blog, but the archived website will stay available. So you can either search for Discovering Desistance, or specifically for the film, just search The Road from Crime, and I'm sure people will find their way to it.
That's right, and you can get it with English subtitles if you struggle with some of the Glaswegian accents.
And French, and German, Italian, and Finnish, I believe.
So. Finnish, how about that? Yeah. Right. So we did the film, we did the workshops, we did the travel, we did a lot of listening, a lot of dialogue. The purpose of all of this was to open up a new conversation with professionals, with the wider society, maybe ambitiously around this concept of desistance. How did we do, Fergus? We may not be the best place to answer these kind of questions of self-assessment, but from your perspective as an insider, without being too overly self-critical, did we do anything? Was it a success as a project, do you think?
It's a hard question to answer, not just obviously because of the problem of our own sort of investment in it. I think we did a huge amount to disseminate enhance people's understanding of desistance, I think we may have done something slightly more important than that too, which was to bring people together and get them listening to each other. I'm not saying that wouldn't have happened otherwise or wasn't already happening in other contexts, but I think we energized those kinds of conversations between different kinds of knowledge in many places eventually around the world. I think one of the key things that was happening around the same time was the kind of rise of user voice ideas in social work, and those were slow to come to criminal justice, which is in itself interesting. Why is it that it's only really in the last 10 years that people have started to consider it legitimate and important to listen to the voices of people who have been through crime and punishment in thinking about how to reform and change those practices. So I think it probably contributed to a groundswell that made it necessary for policymakers and practitioners to start attending to those kinds of voices and concerns. There are lots of concrete small examples of places where teams of practitioners generated concrete ideas to do things differently.
Scotland has to be leading in that way, right?
Yeah, no, there were places in Scotland. The one that just comes to my mind at the moment, though, was in Merseyside, actually, in the Wirral, where we did one of the offshoot workshops, and the practitioners came up with really simple ideas like creating a film club where people on probation and probation staff would watch movies together and talk. Groundbreaking work, but it kind of was, and also they introduced walking supervision or walking dialogue. So rather than doing the kind of formalized office-based interview as the basis for casework, they got out on the streets and walked and talked as friends would. And I'm not suggesting that the relationship is that simple, but those were concrete ways in which the kind of relationship between practitioners and service users changed, and the way that they recognized each other, I think, was altered. There are more grand examples of policies quoting the project or quoting the materials that we developed, but in many respects I wouldn't want to cling too closely to those, because so many of them have been subversions or, to put it crudely, bastardizations of the message or of the work.
So using the name Desistance, but not really changing anything, or
even more broadly, like the whole transforming rehabilitation agenda in England. Yeah. And I'm not suggesting that was driven by this project, far from it. But
won't be claiming that.
No, certainly not. Yes. But that you take a good idea and ruin it by distorting it, and also by, I think, in the case of TR, not to go down a different track here, but deliberately choosing the wrong terminology to obfuscate and obscure what was actually going on. Like, you couldn't call it privatising punishment, so you called it transforming rehabilitation. Yes. So there are lots of ways in which the work that we did and the work of many other academics is often co-opted and misused, and it's our kind of duty to be vigilant about that and to be critical when it happens. So that makes me hesitate from reaching to big policy changes and actually preferring the small examples of how human encounters and relationships have been affected and changed. But in a way, I think the biggest, well, for me personally, one of the most important legacies of the project has been a transformation in my own thinking about the whole subject area. I don't know if you want me to go into that now, or if you want to stick with the...
You've teased us with this at this point, Fergus. We got to hear. How has this changed you?
I think, like all good research projects, you get to the end of it and you realise that you asked the wrong question. So we started from the premise that we wanted probation practice and policy to be reshaped in line with desistance evidence, because that's what we've been on the road trying to do. So it was natural that we kind of tried to come up with a new way for doing that. But what seemed to come out of the dialogue for me was that was never going to be enough, and that internal changes to criminal justice practices, and even narrower than that, one specific subdomain within criminal justice, just couldn't cut it when the barriers to to desistance, and more broadly than that to reintegration, were kind of really rooted in fundamental problems of social inequality and social injustice. And so, again, I don't want to be too crude, but there's a risk with criminal justice reform that you end up polishing a turd. and
we can edit that out, don't we?
You need to be a bit more ambitious in the approach that you take. So, for example, one of the provocative propositions at the end was that we needed to get beyond the criminal justice system and engage and educate the public about crime, punishment, desistance, and reintegration. And for me, the question that I take out, or the unresolved question that provoked at the end of the project for me was how? How are we going to do that? Having spent so long trying to have creative and constructive conversations with policymakers and practitioners, to realise that was not enough, and that there was this broader vista that had to be addressed, was at the same time sort of inspiring and mind-boggling, but also terrifying. How can academics and others really try to engage with very powerful cultural currents? So that was what provoked the next steps.
Slimness
yeah. So that actually maybe that's that there's a concrete impact that I would be really proud to claim. So Alison Urie, who is the founder of Vox Liminis, attended the Glasgow-based workshops when she was still in a different job. Not very happy in the different job, right enough. And she had a track record as a social entrepreneur, as a generator of kind of new charitable endeavours, having previously set up an organisation in Dundee called Hot Chocolate Trust, which did great work with marginalised young people in that city. And she'd had some contact with criminal justice through that project. But it was when she came to those workshops that her kind of mind was blown by the contradictions, inconsistencies, cruelties, and capriciousness of criminal justice. And she, being the kind of person that she is, she was like, okay, what are we going to do about that? And from that pub conversation, famously over beer and chips, was born Vox Liminis as an organisation which tries to exercise that kind of cultural influence by creatively mediating a conversation about crime and punishment, by really helping people think and feel differently about those questions. So that, to me, that is absolutely the product, from my side anyway, of the Desky project. Alison had lots of other tributaries that were kind of influencing her at that moment. And there were many other people also involved in making that work.
And the idea is nothing hits the heart, the public, us, human beings, like music, like the arts. Is that the? I mean, this is public criminology you're trying to do in a different way.
Yeah, we're now talking about creative criminology and about sensory criminology, and it was partly, again, a different strand of your work was influential, because in that pub conversation I was talking about the work that you had done with Anna King over the kind of emotive, or the need to reach beyond cognitive approaches to engaging people on crime and punishment issues. That kind of goes back to Durkheim for me as well. The crime and punishment properly evokes strong emotions. And the usual response of criminologists is to try to push those emotions to the side and replace them with sharp, rational, evidence-based
Let's
stuff.
get smart.
Which is important. As Goya said, the sleep of reason produces monsters. But I think the other approach is to try to engage with those emotions, not to silence them or marginalise them, but to engage with them in a way which involves head and heart, to put it in a slightly cliched way. And we were literally in the pub thinking, well, what is it that engages us affectively without switching off our brains? And, there was like a little ping moment where we think, well, music is where that happens for us. And that's not the only form. There's lots of other, the film had done it. And I think, literature, theatre, any art form inevitably, I think, does that. And so that's kind of what propelled me towards thinking about more creative methods, more creative practices, and more creative forms of public engagement.
I think it's really smart. I think we have to appreciate it. I mean, I'm all for reason and rationality. I wouldn't be an academic doing this work if I wasn't. But at the same point, our subject matter is justice, and justice isn't a logical process. The justice is an emotive, is a sensual idea. It's not something that can easily be made bureaucratized and effective and some kind of, we're not producing widgets here. So I think we need to get creative, and you've been at the forefront of some of these creative methodologies, you and your students, I should say, these sort of creative methodologies and creative ways of thinking about justice. You've done some photography work and things as well around probation.
Yeah, so in the pervasive punishment book, there's a whole element there which draws on visual methods, asking people simply. This was part of a big European project. That this strand was actually led by Wendy Fitzgibbon, who's now, I think, at the University of Leicester. And we just asked people, subject to supervision, to take pictures that represented their experiences. It was the simplest idea, but the images that it produced were shocking to me, because I'd been in the probation field for a long time. I'd been researching it. I'd been listening to interviews. I'd been analysing qualitative data. And there was not a complete disjunction, but a significant divergence between what the images represented and what the interviews seemed to generate. And it really made me reflect on what was going on methodologically there, and seriously engaging with the images and then using them as the prompts for conversations produced much deeper insights for me into how people experience supervision. That produced a paper in Punishment and Society, which preceded the book Pervasive Punishment, and we also locked the photographic method in with the songwriting approach involving Vox in taking those pictures into a songwriting workshop with people under supervision and with social workers and with others to kind of explore in a second creative way these experiences. And what I've found from a methodological point of view is that if I'm kind of co-writing a song along with somebody into which we're both investing our experiences, our thinking, our feelings, then the kind of co-creation of the piece of art, I hesitate to call anything I make art, but the co-creation of the piece of art elicits and enables a different kind of conversation from research dialogues, which are often, well, not often, at their worst they're extractive. So I'm the one with the questionnaire and you're the one with the answers, but you're not going to get anything of me in this exchange. It's not really an exchange of that sort. Whereas the creative exchanges, and this is why I think Alan works as a better interviewer in the film than either you or I would have. It's an exchange of experiences in which all of the humanity of the two protagonists is engaged, not one in a position of detachment with an abstracted intellectual interest and one who's living it. The shift in the quality of the dynamic is what produces the depth of understanding. And you don't necessarily need creative methods to shift that dynamic. Lots of good researchers have known that forever. That's why ethnography is such a great approach, and why great ethnographers are so differently connected with and engaged with their communities and participants in their studies. But yeah, for me it was creative methods that kind of unlocked depth in exploring those kinds of experiences.
The book Pervasive Punishment also uses some fiction writing. You start the book and each chapter with some fiction. What was the thinking there?
Yeah, so that was just that was a kind of then another sort of step in the journey was that if a key premise of Pervasive Punishment is that we can't debate and have a meaningful dialogue about supervision because we can't imagine it. We literally can't imagine it. There's nothing happens in our brains when we ask people to visualize a probation experience. If you say prison, immediately a building appears, a cell appears, a dining hall appears, the Shawshank Redemption appears.
Yeah.
There's something to hang your imagination on, but probation is just a vacuum.
Yeah. In fact, when newspapers, websites run a story about probation, they often use as a photograph of prison, which boggles the mind for those of us who do community-based work. But that's the only visual they've got on stock. Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea of the story was, how can I populate? How can I provoke an imagining of what this is? In fact, it was my wife, Morag, who kind of persuaded me to write it, because I right at the start of the fellowship to write the book, I'd said to her, "Are you going to read this book?" Because she never does.
Question, yeah.
And she said, "Are you going to make it interesting?" Mm-hmm. And I was like, "Well, how? What would make it interesting to you?" Because she's not a criminologist; she's a teacher. And she said, "Well, I like stories. I like human stories." So I said, "Okay, I'll see what I can do." And I went off to the British Criminology Conference, and on the train home, long, slow train home, I wrote an episode, the first episode, pretty much as it appears in the book, and gave it to her when I got back. And she read it and was, "Yeah, I want to know what happens to this guy." And I like the fact that there are characters here that I might start to care about. And so I was also supervising a brilliant writer, Martin Cathcart-Frodin, who just completed his doctorate in fine arts, which involves a short novel about imprisonment and release. It doesn't yet have a published title, so I can't direct you to it, but it's fantastic. And I had no idea why I was supervising him, because I had nothing to teach him about creative writing. I guess I brought a few references from the criminology side to feed his imagination. But the challenge of supervising him kind of switched me on to trying to write in a fictional way. But it's very much sociological fiction. So there's barely a line in that story that I couldn't put references in, to say the. And then actually, and there's a postscript to the book where I kind of try to explain, to a certain extent, the sources and the thinking behind the development of the characters and the plot.
Right.
I should also give a shout out to my colleague Jo Collinson-Scott, who co-writes that postscript, because she then went off with a range of collaborators and wrote an EP of songs called System Hold, which is a beautiful and brilliant oral representation, sonic representation of some of the themes that emerge from the book. So, yeah, these are all essentially ways of helping us to explore experiences or institutions or cultures or practices that are invisible or at least remote and detached from everyday experience. And I think if criminology can't make that kind of connection for people, then the quality of evidence that it brings is marginalised, too easily marginalised in favour of things that do appeal to our more sort of visceral instincts about punishment. So that's why I've been sort of pushed down that route.
It has been, the perennial complaint of criminology students for 100 years. But we're doing all this research, and when there's something in the news, as there's always something in the news, they never turn to us. They never turn to criminology. They turn to those who've been there. They turn to things they've seen or heard in films, usually CSI or the like, and that's again, that's the nature of this beast. That's perfectly natural. That the first thing people think of with when we're dealing with such a topic as crime and justice isn't necessarily the evidence and where's the data on this issue. It's a different level. So I think I think you're absolutely right to try to engage then on that level in a sociological way. I mean, one of my favorite professors used to say that sociological theory is a story. You need to tell a story, and it's a different kind of story than it's not a unique story or an individual story. It's a general story about the way these things happen, almost an archetypal story, but for you to work and work fiction into your research isn't new in that we all do. That's what theory is working these sort of fictions into our work. So I think we're probably out of time on the podcast. We're certainly not out of time in terms of Fergus McNeill and Desistance and where this journey is going to go next. I'm really pleased you sat down with us here for a while this morning, and look forward to the next project from you, Fergus.
Thanks for having me.